profesor na Jagiellonski univerzi v Krakowu, ker je tudi direktor znanstvenega arhiva Poljske akademije znanosti in pa Poljske akademije znanosti in umetnosti. En arhiv pa dve ustanovi. Zanimiva zgodovina, ampak o tem ne bomo govorili. Gostoval je marsikje po svetu, zlasti v ZDA, zelo dobro sodeluje z ameriškimi akademskimi inštitucijami, tudi s pomočjo nekaterih ameriško-poljskih štipendij in pa Fulbrightove štipendije. Sicer pa se ukvarja predvsem socialno in kulturno zgodovino Galicije, zgodovino žensk in pa z intelektualno zgodovino. Objavil je zelo veliko, nazadnje s kolegom Kamilom Rušalo, ki ga tudi mnogi dobro poznamo, dva zbornika, Intellectuals and World War I, to je bil rezultat ene zelo zanimive konference, ki sem se jo jaz tudi udeležil, potem nisem nič napisal. In pa drugi zbornik je Post-War Continuity and New Challenges in Central Europe 1918-1923, The War That Never Ended. Sicer pa bo danes govoril o prvi svetovni vojni. Zdaj, stoletnica je minila, ampak raziskovalno se pa s vojno še vedno ukvarjamo. Čeprav seveda je zdaj bolj aktualna povojna tranzicija, so aktualne povojne transformacije, ampak on bo govoril o transformaciji v času prve svetovne vojne. Skratka, between Imperial and National Galicia in the time of transformation 1914-1918. Tomasz, the floor is yours.
Rok, thank you very much for invitation. Thank you very much for a very nice introduction. After such a wonderful introduction, I think I should keep silence and just move out. But if we are all here, so that is why I think we can at least try to have an hour to speak something about this Galicia. Of course, we are speaking about Austrian Galicia, not Slovenian Galicia and not Spanish Galicia. Okay, so I did my homework. Let's say the Slovenian point of view. And if you are in Slovenia, this is my very first time at your university, and thank you very much for this invitation. I was thinking that maybe I could start with the Slovenian author. And Luigi Casimir is a very famous guy who had his short period in Galicia. Yeah? So, of course, as a point of reference, I decided to take two journeys. This is already 1915. The Russians are partially taken out of Galicia, and Luigi Casimir, who was a guy from Ptuj, a very good eater, painter and printmaker, he decided to go to Galicia and to create a set of artistic designs, and they are very, very nice. Yeah? So sometimes they are just every single day pictures capturing what people were doing. Sometimes they are ruins. Let's say Gorlice, this is very, very powerful. And at the very beginning, in this very slide, this is the Chamesh Fortress, which was looked like from Zasani, so the second part of the city perspective. So this is quite nice. It was published already in German in 1915. But of course, much more famous journey, it was the journey of Ferenc Molnár, a very important figure for Hungarian history of journalism as well as literary circles. And of course, we know him because the Pole Street Boys. But of course, he also was commissioned to go to Galicia and to write reports for Hungarian press. But we know that press in that time was under huge censorship, so the good question is what Molnár could have written and of course what was not included. And of course the good question is why Galicia? Why all of a sudden this very neglected, far away to the north region became an object of interest of so many different people because there are only two individuals? What happened there? Why, let's say, these rumors were spread? Why so many people from Hungary, in this case, Slovenia, really wanted to see this land? The land after trauma and in the process of trauma, because we know that the Russians were not pushed aside. This is already 1915, the Brusilov army would come back in 1916, and as a matter of fact, the whole province was not liberated. And of course, my question is, can we say that in 1915, in May, we are speaking about liberation? So, of course, very, very briefly, in Galicia before 1914, I thought that we would have some students on board. That is why I made it also for students. So, of course, the factor of which unified the whole nations of the very multicultural and multi-ethnic monarchy was old, good Franz Josef, if we speak from propaganda point of view. We know that he was not so good, even if he was quite old in that time. Of course, like in every region of monarchy, there were many, many tensions, political tensions between the Poles and the Ukrainians. Galicia was predominantly ruled by Poles, but Ukrainian national consciousness was rising decade after decade, and that is why they also wanted to have much more to say in the public. Of course, like this is also a typical region for Central Europe of that time, so catching up industrially. So let's say the industry was not a very good factor. It was not Bohemia, it was not Austria, but of course, decade after decade it also changed. So when we are speaking about Galician oil fields, before 1914, they are very, very powerful and very mighty. That is why this is very important from the monarchy perspective to protect them. Yeah, because they were like, let's say, and I'm not exaggerating right now, like the third most effective when we try to compare the other oil fields in the world. What I like very, very much, this is Robert Musil's approach to Central Europe, and he is always writing about the Central European mentality. And I think partially we may say that this is true. Can we say that it was happy, simple life of neighbors? Definitely not. Occasionally yes, but very often not. Musil was trying in his literature to catch the phenomenon of Central Europeans. That because we are still in Central Europe, if you don't believe me, go to the streets of Ljubljana and see the architecture. This is much more Central Europe than Adriatic coast. So focusing on everyday life pleasures and problems, narrow-mindedness, we can argue with it or not, but this is what Musil was writing in his volumes. Very often bored and quarrelsome, and I think this is also a kind of a situation, and passion hedonism. And of course, if we like literature and taking literature as a very good source in our research, I think we can find many examples giving us this kind of approach. And what is absolutely important, and why once again the First World War is crucial for Galician, the people didn't see outsiders, the outside troops, since 1849, so since the Russians. Very, very briefly, the map of Galicia of that time. This pink points. This is of course Galicia of today, the Polish part and the Ukrainian part. That is why sometimes this is also typical for Central Europe. We have so many names for one place. Yeah, but of course this is very universal. The first weeks. I do like very much this newspaper report. I think maybe we can focus a bit. This is about Przemyśl. The foreign, or let's say the ours, but outsider journalists from Hungary, from Austria, from Bohemia is coming to Przemyśl because this is the hope for the monarchy. Everybody knew that something is wrong with the army in the very eastern Galicia, that the army is not successful as we thought it could be, but of course officially we cannot write it. Yeah? So still this is a very good example of the propaganda. Look at the very end, yeah, Kings Peter and Nikita. Yeah? So we are trying to diverse the public opinion. Do not worry, because let's say in the south, yeah, so in your region, we are just very easy to beat them up, yeah. So and of course we are so mighty. The fortress, the Chamesh Fortress, the key to the kingdom of Hungary, would preserve, yeah. So this is a very good example. This is already end of August. The situation in the Eastern Front is definitely bad. But what do we have in the press reports? False. So what do we have? What is typical for the Galician? And I think not only for the Galician, but let's say we were the first one who witnessed the front, the shock of the failure. So what is very, very horrible, that people couldn't believe that the monarchy is as weak as they could witness. There were so many refugees coming from Ternopil, Charkiv, Stanislaviev, going east. At the very, very beginning, it was not all organized. People were shocked. Why? Because they were very often brought up with the stories of the Cossacks or Mongols. And here you have also another example, another quotation from memoirs. The lady in Krakow, so far away from the warfare, and she's describing what the word Moscow, or let's say the Russian, meant for the people in Galicia of that time. So majority of them had never any kind of contact with the Russians, but they were still, the rumors about the brutality of the Cossacks were so popular. We shouldn't be surprised. The revolution of 1905, the Bloody Sunday at the end of 1890s, this is what, let's say, the Poles from Russian partition witnessed, or let's say, were much more familiar with. Very, very briefly, because this is not my topic, something about the battles. So you can see that this is already September, the end of September 1914, and the Russian troops are going eastwards. I think in the middle you can find Chamesh encircled by the Russians, and of course 3 attempts to get the Chamesh Fortress. The first one very, very easy. The Austrians were very productive. They rejected the Russians. Even heir to the throne decided to pay homage. It was very nice. It was very propagandistic. Great. But just a few weeks later, a new army approached. The Austrians and the Hungarians were pushed aside, and the fortress was circled for many, many months. Now we know that it's partially bad management, bad distributing the food, absolutely horrible treatment of the privates, especially Polish, Ukrainian privates were horribly treated by the German and the Hungarian officers, and that is why the fortress collapsed in March 22nd. This is not like it was lack of supplies. So much was found immediately after capturing the fortress by the Russians. And of course, in May 1915, the Germans and the Hungarians from Gorlice are going eastwards, and the fortress was recaptured. Yeah? So very, very briefly speaking about the warfare. What we can find? Huge destruction. After the centenary, we have a very good literature about how much was destroyed by both armies. So not only by the Russian army, but also, let's say, German-Hungarian army. When the Russians were in Galicia, and I think this is quite interesting, they were also making notes about important cultural heritage. I pointed out only one thing. This is the mitra of the Greek Catholic Bishop of Przemyśl. It was believed that it was a crown of the Danilo Halicki, so the king of Galicia from the mid-13th century. It was very, very precious. And even if it wasn't, still it was one of the medieval objects of the Ruthenian principality of that time. Of course, it was taken. Many historians from Petersburg and Moscow were sent to Galicia just to make notes what is precious, what is valuable, and what should be sent to the east. Of course, we have also forced migration. So when the Russians came to Galicia, since almost the very, very beginning, they forced people to move eastwards. And of course, when they were losing the war, lots of people were just taken on the trains and sent as far as possible. First of all, the Jews, many Ruthenians who were pro-Russians, prisoners of wars, and a huge chapter just opened. Yeah? So mass moving of the people. Yeah? So very, very, very briefly. Of course, when we are speaking about Galicians outside Galicia, so I think this is very known topic, especially now after this many conferences and events of the centenary. Lots of refugees in almost every single province outside of Galicia. But the problem was that almost everything was not functioning properly. Very easy train journeys, let's say from Krakow to Prague, a couple of hours. Now, sometimes a couple of days. People blocked in the trains, they couldn't move out. The Czechs were absolutely against receiving the refugees. No one was in the country prepared for such a large number of refugees. Sometimes it was organized by states, or state authorities. Very often people just panicked and they move out, so that is why they have no possibility to get any kind of financial support from the country later on. What was the whole idea, especially in Czech Republic, Bohemia, not Czech Republic, Czech Kingdom. So just to get rid of the problem and, let's say, move the transport, let's say, to Austria, to Styria, etc., etc. So what is absolutely horrible experience for the Galicians, whatever the ethnicity, that they are treated not as equal citizens of the monarchy, but as subhumans. This is they who should be blamed that we are not victorious. Maybe they should have stayed from the authorities' point of view. So all of a sudden the nations of the monarchy are not treated properly or equally. Yeah? And of course, in famous internment camps. Let's say only one example from so many over here, Talerhof. And if we are thinking about Ukrainian or Ruthenian, because very often this is not the same, but let's make it easier. For the Ukrainian consciousness, Talerhof is one of the most important point of reference. And the atrocities against the Ukrainians who ended up there, who were very often intelligentsia member, Greek Catholic priests, this is one of the most painful point of reference in the history. But of course, this is not only a bad experience. Very often, I think we prove it very nicely during our First World War conferences. And people were also embracing opportunities. Some of them ended up in Vienna, some of them in Olomouc, Prague, so in big centers, big cities. Some of them were rich. Some aristocrats, some bishops, yeah. So not everybody was a peasant, not everybody was poor, even if it was an experience of a majority. So what was the most important, and that is why, let's say, such organization like the Relief Committee for Galician and Bukovinian refugees was important, to find my beloved ones. So in this huge chaos of autumn 1914, people were moving here and there. Then finally they settled, some at the end of fall. Now they are looking for information. And this is, I think, also a common experience of the whole generation. I like this letter very much. I found it in the Chamesh archive of my native city. Lady is writing to her beloved ones. But look here, I think this is something very tricky. So let's say they were apart for months. Probably, the mentality also changed. People were much more loose. We don't have a letter written by him to her. We have only the answer. And definitely she is a bit stressed up that after so many months, maybe he would like to have any kind of sexual intercourse, but she is not prepared for it. She still wants to keep her beliefs, and definitely they are before marriage. So before getting married, this is not proper. Yeah. So I know I'm scared of your passion. Yeah. So sometimes we have in these primary sources also some information about how people felt and how they were afraid of these meetings. Yeah? Will you promise not to interact so quickly? We cannot say. Yeah? Okay. So that is why I like it very much. What we also have in these primary sources, and we are speaking about good experience. People who are lucky enough to end up in Vienna, and we know that Vienna was not very open, frankly speaking, or let's say gently speaking, for refugees. But they are writing about visiting museum, finding new places. So for the very first time, I don't know, some middle-class members, let's say from Stanisławiec or from Tarnopil, who heard about Vienna, but never had money possibility, people to get to know, to go to Vienna, now they are. So of course they are just embracing opportunities. I promised something for Slovenia. This is what I shared with one of my article. This is about the Reverend Jan Schnadel. He was just a priest from my home diocese, so from the Diocese of Chamesh. He was forced to move. And what is nice, after his coming back, he wrote a very nice memoir report to the local press. And what is very, very nice, he's trying to share his experience, and I think when he tried to compare with the other sources written by the priests who came back from, let's say, in this case from Slovenia, he tries to look at the problem from different point of view. Not only his priest's experience, not only the Polish perspective, but he also tries to deal with the Slovenian perspective. Yeah, so let's say that it was not only that we were at need, the locals also had so many problems. Yeah, so what do we have? This is also very typical. Shock of the long journey, unknown place after a couple of days. So many refugees ended up in Reichenburg. If I'm not mistaken, this is not the biggest place in Slovenia of today. And it was much smaller all the time. And of course, unprepared inhabitants. And nobody asked the locals, are you willing to accept the refugees? Refugees never heard about the place. Yeah? So this is a shock for both sides, and he knew it. And of course it was a huge problem how to provide food, work, and of course houses. What I like very much, and this is what I stressed before, Schnadel is writing also about misbehavior of the Poles. That not everybody was grateful for the locals to be hosted. It was almost already winter, so it was very hard also for the locals. He was lucky because he spent his time in a convent very close by, but he knew what his companions of the journey were doing. Yeah? He also took opportunity to get to know the whole region very closely. So when it was a bit milder, he went to travel, and he compared the behavior of the Catholic priests in Slovenia with the Polish ones. Yeah, so what was different? What kind of people the Slovenians were working with? That is why I like the source very, very much. And of course, what was not so typical from Galician point of view, but it was absolutely crucial from Slovenian point of view, why everything stopped in May 1915. Why all of a sudden the Slovenians were so eager to get rid of the Galicians, because now they are very often refugees, yeah, and they have to find their own places. Being intimate. This is, I think, also very important of that time. When I first come across with this letter, I thought this is about female and male writing. But letter after letter, I found I found something else, and this is not like that. This is male writing to another male, yeah? So they are friends. Okay, we know that being affectionate in male's writing of the epoch is typical, yeah? So they were much more, maybe not careless, but let's say much more affectionate while sharing the emotions. But I think this is a very rare example, at least let's say for the Polish writing, maybe not for the German writing. I know that we have this kind of research done for Germany, that two boys are sharing their experience, which is at least homophile experience. Yeah? I cannot prove it because I don't have any extraordinary sources. We have only names. It could be anybody, as a matter of fact. But this is something different. Yeah? So I like this very much because I think this is very, very rare. And let's say from the Polish perspective, I think the historians were not so eager to follow, let's say, this kind of letters, even if, of course, we have to be careful with making statements. Letters from Russia are also very interesting. There are regular motifs. Look at the picture. Probably before the war, it would never happen. And definitely the ladies would never allowed to be taken with the other men's lying just close by. Yeah? So even if they were lying, but definitely the photos wouldn't be taken. Yeah? This is something different. And what do we have? There are definitely regular motifs. It's up to the person. So many Galicians. So once again, the Poles, Ukrainians, especially Jewish people, were forced to move. Sometimes very close by, but very often so far away, like Tajikistan. Yeah? So even today, from our perspective, is so far away. So of course, we have to remember that it was also censorship there. But as we know, and I know this maybe not shouldn't say it loudly, but there are some pros and cons of Russian army, and let's say corruption and let's say inefficiency is one of them. So that is why I think let's say this correspondence is much authentic. So people were not so afraid of writing about their feelings, about their situation, because they knew that only a couple of letters would be checked. And we know that also in Germany and also Hungary there was so much flood of letters that even the censorship here in Central Powers were not so effective as it was supposed to be. Yeah? So a new experience, so men and women together. Very rarely we have this in the letters, but we can find occasionally in other sources. So of course it was a kind of a cross of the mental borders. Yes, it was, especially for women. I like very much the collection of Eugeniusz Złotnicki. He was a teacher from my home town, who was a teacher soldier taken by the Russians, and his wife was left with children, like on the spot. She was not working before the war. His salaries was just enough. But all of a sudden she was forced to do something to provide food and provide shelter for the children. She had some helpers, but now, during the war, she needs to start working. The husband is so far away, and of course, what do we have in the letters? They are totally different letters, written by him to the family, and of course, written by her to him in faraway Tashkent. Yeah? So, beauty of the landscape, despair of being apart, history of the region, and of course, lack of any kind of comfort. Yeah? So priests were absolutely important. Yeah? So if there were any kind of priests, even a very lazy one, it was still a kind of comfort for the people of that time. They were very, very religious, and those who were religious, it was also a great comfort for them. It was a bit different, of course, with atheists or those who were not believers. He came back after 5 years, and this is not very long, as a matter of fact. This is nice that the collection preserved, and of course she is a bit different woman. She didn't want to come back only to the family just to be a housekeeper. Yeah? Now she got another chance. After 5 years she was a family feeder. Roman Dybowski is also a very nice person. He is a very good example of intellectual who was in a good age to be taken to the army. Very typical story. Very often he was captured prisoner. He was sent to Russia, but he was lucky. The Russians easily realized that he was professor of English philology, which was very, very rare in that time. Of course, Great Britain was allied with Russia. That is why they needed specialists, even if they were from Central Powers region. So that is why he was lucky in 1917. Okay, he was a prisoner of war, but he could have published. He was writing some pamphlets, some work on Shakespeare, because he specialized in Shakespeare of that time. Everything was nice till 1917. All the situation changed, and he was taken to Siberia. We have very nice collection of letters sent by him to the university authorities. University authorities try to take him back to Krakow. Once again, he was the only English professor in any kind of university in Poland of that time. So the only one. I know this is very hard to believe it today, but it was just the beginning of the English studies in Poland. Yeah? He came back January 1922. And, after 7 years. So, what is very nice, we have his memoirs written and published. I think it was also a kind of dealing with trauma. Yeah? So, Pudłocki writing about Russia and Siberia, and we can confront his memoirs also with the letters. Yeah? So, he was very extensive with writing letters. And of course, how to come back from Russia. Sometimes, if you're lucky, it was a train. Sometimes a carriage. Very often, your own foot. Yeah, so that is why of course, he was laughing when he came back because he was quite fluffy. So he said, at least I'm much slimmer than I was before the war. Yeah. So coming back home, you are coming back home, and this is the situation you can come across in Galicia. Yeah. So lots of difficulties to get there. War damages, so many of them. Very often all villages burned to the ground. So should I come? Or maybe I should stay in Prague, in Vienna. Many Jews decided to stay. Because they knew that maybe this is not my Galicia. Maybe Franz Josef is much older than I thought. And we know that he passed away very soon. And of course, shock of this destruction. So very often, even if people came back, they had no idea what to do after, and they were looking new places. And of course, it is good to come back with Austro-Hungarian troops, maybe not to Galicia. So, on one hand, this is a propaganda photo. The people were greeted in the Chamesh Market Square. So, Bavarian troops, Austrian troops, and Hungarian troops. But immediately after, a huge shock, another shock for the Galician occurred. Because Galicia was treated as a conquered land. So on one hand we have our army, but this is not our army anymore because they treated us as traitors. Yeah, so once again, scapegoat shock, or looking for scapegoat. This is not only late summer and early fall 1914, this is also 1915. Once again, divide et impera, a typical Austrian way of ruling. So let's say, the Poles with the initiative to be independent, they are not so trustworthy as they could be. Maybe we can find another ones. Some Austrians, some Ukrainians strongly believe that, let's say, maybe Austria and Germany could help Ukraine to rise again after so many centuries. But let's say Ukrainians were treated differently. If you were Ruthenian, if you were not a member of the Greek Catholic Church, if your, let's say, ideology was a bit to the east, so we call them Russophiles, you were treated as traitor. If you prove yourself loyal to the Kaiser, you are a member of Greek Catholic, you are connected also with the army, so of course you are worth being supported. So we cannot say that all the Ukrainians were on this side or the other side. What do we have immediately in June 1915? So many peasants, city dwellers and priests were arrested. So once again, what I'm trying to say, this is not only for 1914, but of course later. So that is why we have in the parish chronicles, or let's say the convent chronicles, something like this statement. So the Russians are bad, the Germans are bad, but the worst scoundrels are the Honveds. So that is why, let's say, for the last couple of years, when it was, let's say, this official political friendship between Hungary and Poland, we as the historians had so many second thoughts that maybe some occasionally we shouldn't say about the First World War, because definitely Polish-Hungarian friendship was not very efficient in that time. Yeah. So the Honveds' behavior we have it very often in the ecclesiastical sources. I know some distant places, so they didn't behave so oddly and so brutally in the bigger centers, like Krakow, Przemyśl, Lviv, because still there were so many people. But in the countryside, yeah? And so once again, I think, let's say, so many different sources are giving us a bit different attitude. And of course, people couldn't believe it. Why so much violence? Yeah? This nonsense, violent behavior, this is also kind of a problem. How to explain why our army behave like that? And of course that is why both nations, so the Poles and Ukrainians, were also looking its own way. There were some national units, the Polish legionaries under Józef Piłsudski and the Ukrainian rifles as a part of the Austro-Hungarian army. Yeah, so they were under command of the German officers. We know, I know that this is trivial, that the death of Franz Josef also changed the attitude of the people. I don't know, maybe if he stepped, resigned, but we know this was not the system of that time, that he could have stepped, resigned. And of course, problematic Karl. Yeah, so on one hand, a new person, very nice. But maybe Charles Brennan should say something more about Charles, because this is definitely his field. So let's say for the Galicians, after 1916, this is not only Vienna as a point of view. Now it's much more Warsaw. Definitely this is Kiev for the Ukrainians. Ukrainians are looking that maybe in this huge chaos in Russia, we would be once again united. What was absolutely outrageous for the Poles, this is February 1918, and the Treaty of the Brest-Litovsk. For the Ukrainians, it was a wonderful occasion to show, yes, we are finally treated as semi-partner by the Central Powers. And some parts of the former Polish kingdom would be given to the rising Ukraine. For the Poles, it was a huge shock. It was like a treason. Even those who were very, very conservative, let's say the Bishop of Przemyśl, Percha, very conservative guy, he openly during the public meeting said that he had been wrong as a politician. I think it's very, very rare that today bishops are saying that they are wrong, making a public statement. So this is also something different. Yeah? So on one hand, you were a huge conservative, but you know that your Kaiser is not your Kaiser anymore. Yeah? But of course, when we try to look why, let's say, the Ukrainians were not so lucky in fighting for the country or resurrection of the country, I think it's also a kind of a problem with propaganda. Majority of pamphlets and books and specialists were written or public only in German. The Poles were, let's say, playing both sides, being, let's say, partitioned. Yeah, it was the only option to do so. So some stuff was written in French, occasionally in English. English was so popular. Majority of the focus of the Ukrainian propaganda was just for German speakers. So immediately after the war, they were allied, they were associated only with the Central Powers. That's why their cause was not so highly recognized by the victorious. What I like victorious powers. What I like very, very much, because my time I think I still have about 15 minutes, not more. And I should try to keep my time, not to cross it. Why people were also dissatisfied with the monarchy. Of course, the administration was not functioning well, as it was proven, let's say, by Peter Judson. The ties with the Vienna were not so close. The salaries were not paid properly as they should be, especially in Galicia. It was a problem with supplies on a very basic level. But sometimes it is also something different. Sisters Eckert, two sisters, two teachers, were trying to be cured in Switzerland. So, this is 1916, the railway connection is still working, so how about to go to Switzerland finally to do something with the health? And I think this is a very nice example how single women, or let's say sisters, because they were not one sister, but sisters, were treated on the way. They had no male companion, they were only both of them. And they were shocked how the staff of the railways, and they were traveling before the war quite effectively to Vienna, treated them on the way, already when they left Galicia. So some were in Bohemia, already in Austria. So they were so many often checked. They had to bribe the officers. Very often they felt humiliated because, let's say, it is written, maybe not openly, but I think we can decipher between the lines that the officers were touching them, not in the proper ways. Yeah? And of course, they were shocked because they saw, let's say, the people from Bohemia or Austria traveling, female companions, and they were not treated as so. So, of course, they were asking questions. People were interested in what is going on in Galicia in that time. But once again, they were treated as definitely inferior in comparison to the Czechs and the Austrians. So extraordinary stops just to check the papers. So very easy drive, nothing extraordinary to go to Switzerland before 1914, probably not more than 2, maximum 3 days riding by train. Now it's very, very humiliating. So even such occasion was a kind of a message sent for the Galicians, guys, you are still not a part of us, and from Vienna perspective, and also from Austria perspective, you are just a second-rate citizens. And coming swiftly to the very, very end. I'm not claiming that there were not Germans, that there were not Czechs, and there were not others living in Galicia. Especially female Czech bands were extremely popular. You know that the Czech people are very, very musical, much more than the Poles. So they were extremely popular before the First World War, especially female, yeah? So because it was a kind of a bohemian taste, even in a very distant places, yeah? So not only male players, but also the female players. And everybody thought that somehow they could stay. Very often they were not only young ladies, but sometimes, I don't know, they spent 5 years, 6 years. They were doing quite well among the locals. And what happened in the fall 1918? When so many soldiers are coming back, let's say from Italy, from Slovenia, from western parts of the falling monarchy. The Galicians had such bad experience with the Hungarians, with the Germans, with so many people on the spot when they were refugees, that they felt that maybe Galicia should be somehow cleaned out of the different people. So those who couldn't prove that they spent a bit longer than only 5 or 6 years, they were immediately erased. And what do we have? We have so many letters sent to local authorities, but let's say female Czech or German people who didn't have a permanent residency in the cities, that they would like to stay. With all respect, I haven't been to Bohemia for 10 years or 5 years or whatever. This is my home. I'm speaking Polish or Ukrainian quite well. Maybe I should stay. And 99% of the replies is no. We do not want to have outsiders. We have so many complicated situations already in the fall 1918 that, of course, we have to get rid of the aliens. Yeah? Of course, fall 1918, this is also a problem with the Jews. So many anti-Semitic behaviors and tensions in whole Galicia. There is a war between the Poles and the Ukrainians, started already in November the 1st. And, of course, new system is arising. Of course, the Poles were victorious in spring 1919. We all know it. And of course, if the Ukrainians wanted to stay in Galicia, they have to prove their loyalty. They have to swear the allegiance to the state. And very often they didn't want to do it. We know that till 1923, the status, official status of Eastern Galicia was discussable. So that is why, let's say, the war was not over, even in May or in June 1919. For the many Ukrainians, they had the hope that maybe, if not the separate state, so at least autonomy for Eastern Galicia within the Polish state. Was it so far away from truth? No, it wasn't, because Silesia got an autonomy and a separate diet, so they thought that maybe they could do it. But we know that March 15th, the Council of Ambassadors said, no, forget about it, this is the part of new Second Republic of Poland. And that is why so many people ended up in Czechoslovakia. And the new story, post-war story of Ukrainians from Eastern Galicia. That is why, let's say, the war, the whole tensions were not over, and that is why, let's say, wonderful history of Ukrainian University in Prague. And summary. Already in 1915, when the first refugees were coming from central and western part of monarchy to Galicia, and especially to Eastern Galicia, there were kind of articles, what about our experience outside? And this is very nice, because first of all, they were looking at the Czech and Austrian perspective, that, let's say, the Austrians were much better involved in industry, and maybe finally, this is not the dream of every mother to be for the sons to be a clerk, but maybe there's also something else. Maybe we should focus much more on vocational and technical schools. We should catch up industrially, because, let's say, Bohemia is a very good example that they could rise and they could be much more better from financial point of view. But I think we also know that for the last couple of years that this is not only a huge break, so the fall 1918, but many continuities are seen. So when we try to look at the police, very often they are just a former Austro-Hungarian members of the police or gendarmerie. They're just changing robes or changing faces. When you're speaking about the teachers, especially from the local point of view, they're just the same teachers. Sometimes either too conservative or too connected with the former system. They were looking for a new life now in Polish Lithuania. So let's say this part of Lithuania which was Polish and not a part of the Republic of Lithuania. They go to Greater Poland, so to the north or to the Warsaw. Yeah. So sometimes they thought that maybe they are too known in the locality. So let's say the new Poland is much bigger. Now we can have a new life, and lots of them they have the new life because it was lack of administration, lack of intellectuals, because there was no Polish universities in Warsaw, there was no universities in Poznań, so let's say in Posen in Germany. So now the Galician conquering Poland. And of course the locals were complaining. Why, let's say, the Galicians should tell us how to be the Pole? If we were here in Prussian partition, much better organized than them. Okay, they are better educated, but we know how to do the money. Let's say this is the same story from Warsaw perspective. Okay, we survived the Russians. Why we should have so many? Why we have to deal with flood of Galicians, and they should know how to do it better? Okay, the Galicians had this experience how to manage it a bit better. They were members of the Vienna Parliament. It was a local diet in Lviv. This politics was not so great in the Russian experience. So we can see also those people who were strongly engaged in the old system, like Leon Bielinski. Bielinski, the former Minister of Treasury in Vienna, the governor of Bosnia and Herzegovina. He was hired by Marshal Piłsudski, or let's say by Prime Minister, also to serve the new country. And of course, Bielinski is just one example. But whatever we try to say about continuities, and I think, let's say, this topic has still lots of potential, we can like it or not, for people like Dybowski, who had so many friends and relatives in Vienna. He was a Vienna graduate. When he ended up finally in Poland, he was sent to London to do his field, to do research on his field. He wrote something like that he had no idea that the First World War had changed the attitude of the European nations to each other so much. Can we cooperate with Germans in 1921, 22, 23? Or maybe they should be just left behind. Maybe we should be focused only on France, and France is enough, or maybe Great Britain. And we know that they were not so befriended as they were already in 1918. So the New World. And let's say this intellectual cooperation, this is one thing, continuities and discontinuities, the people's ties, the families, which were just just cut from each other. What about those Jews who ended up in Vienna? They never came back, and their relatives stayed in Galicia. And the wonderful story, I think we have this story in Budapest in 2014, so mapping Budapest with monuments of the fallen ones who are not a part of Hungarian Empire anymore, but now we are paying homage for them in the Budapest city center. Okay guys, thank you very much. I didn't overcross my time.
So, since nobody is throwing us out just yet, there is some time for questions, perhaps a few brief ones, if there are any, of course. The floor is open for questions.
Thank you very much.
If you want to answer them, I mean.
I know, if I am able to answer the questions. Because, sometimes the questions are too challenging that, it's better not to answer.
Yeah. I was wondering about that teacher, the correspondence that you mentioned. So you actually have both letters.
Both letters.
So this
okay, probably not every single letter and postcard, but I think it's like 15 from one side and about 12 from the other side. Yeah, so which I think is still nice, especially that it was not so close by. With all respect to Tashkent, it's far away, even today.
I mean, this is rather rare. It does not happen that often that both are presented. There is the case that Jiří Hutečka published about. He also had both sets, so from one in the other side, but usually you just, often you just get one side of the correspondence.
Yes, that is true. Yeah. So that is why when I'm speaking about the Bosco, we have his letters written to university authorities, and only, I know, some draft, but only I think one or two of drafts sent to Russia, but we don't have, let's say, the letters sent by a rector, because even Rector Magnificus was involved in this case. Probably it would be enough for the Russian authorities. Yeah, but of course it was not effective.
He was not the only case. I think Morley, who ended up in Krakow later on after the war, he was also actually teaching
in Tomsk.
He actually got his habilitation in Tomsk, and he was very annoyed because after he returned, it was not recognized, so he had to do another one.
Yeah.
So, this is actually, these are interesting stories because they tell us that these fates of POWs or their stories could be quite different.
Okay, I can give you another story. It's also the reverend the priest from my place, so from Chamesh. He was sent by the bishop in 1970 to Innsbruck University to do his PhD in theology. And what is tricky, so he came back, he didn't complete it, but he wrote a letter to Jagiellonian University authorities that he would like to have the final exam from theology, and his dissertation was lost. What is tricky? After years we are digging in Innsbruck archives, so there is no dissertation, only one exam was passed. So we cannot even prove what kind of dissertation it could be, because the priest was not even writing a title of the dissertation. Yeah, okay, he obtained PhD at the Faculty of Theology at Jagiellonian in 1925, but his intellectual stories are at least discussable. Yeah. So sometimes I think the war was also a kind of opportunity, to hide some past. Yeah. So let's say Wziątek is a very good example.
It's also understandable that in 1917, during the war, he was not so eager to focus on his PhD in theology. He had other stuff to do.
Probably.
Anyways, questions?
No, I just wanted to say that, thank you for this really interesting lecture. I wanted to point it out that Kazimir was not in Galicia on his own, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
He was appointed by the War Press Office, and he made this really nice,
etchings.
Yes, and it was not so much propaganda for the Austro-Hungarians. It's really interesting this how he captured the Galician. Anyway, I found really interesting. Many references could be, and many similarities with what happened with the Slovenian, not only refugees.
Mm-hmm.
let's say, when you talked about the attitude of the locals of the convert or Germans in respect to the locals, we can find it in many testimonies after the Caporetto.
Caporetto, okay.
Yes, and when the Germans were here, also in Ljubljana, or convert who treated the locals very badly. So there are so many similarities, and we could talk about them a lot. So thank you very much, really.
So maybe we should organize another Slovenian-Polish conference,
Yes,
as it was organized a couple of years ago, yeah?
Yes, it would be nice, yeah. We enjoyed it, really.
Yeah, exactly. It was Krakow.
And published in both languages, which I think is nice. Yeah. So
yes, and also presented in both languages. It was a tricky experience, but it was very nice.
It worked out well, actually. Yeah.
Yes, we were talking in Slovene, but it was on
the translation was
screen,
projected. Okay. Any more questions?
Yes, I have another one. When you talked about the sisters, and if I'm not mistaken, you said that they were treated badly because they were not just like Czechs or Austrians. What about this as a gender point of view? Were they treated badly also because they were women and alone on the... Okay.
Yeah, this is definitely female staff. Yeah, so the train staff, the railway staff, they are men, and I think they overusing their position. Yeah, and of course, how we know it, because they wrote about it in the newspaper. It's a kind of report written in the newspaper. So once again, we cannot. We have to read between the lines, because if it was a newspaper, it was still a censorship. So they couldn't write everything what they wanted. But I think at least this is also quite courageous that they are complaining already at the end of 1916 on the system in the press, and of course about the monarchy. So this is not only about the local stuff, but let's say, but also on the whole way. And of course Switzerland is portrayed totally differently. Of course, we know that it was neutral, but yeah. So definitely, this gender perspective is absolutely crucial to get to know it.
So,
I would have a question. Thank you for your lecture. As the field of my research is literature, actually century literature.
Fantastic!
My comment will be actually a question. You mentioned Robert Musil.
Robert Musil.
But you would also mention Bruno Schulz or somewhere else. So for you as historian, how do you find literature, I mean fiction or another genres like travelogues or memoirs, as a source of your research? How would you comment that, use it or reuse it?
Because I am a member of the Department of the History of Culture and Education, that is why, let's say, literature is absolutely very, very important for us. And as a matter of fact, I know what about Slovenia, but let's say in Poland we have a quite a long experience how to use even poetry and literature as a source. Of course, it's much easier till realism. Let's say this 20th century poetry and literature is not so helpful, but definitely I think it could be inspirational, especially for mental research, cultural research. And I don't know what about in Slovenia, but let's say if we are trying to find some sources in this way, we are not focusing on the great novels. So those novels who are the most important, because let's say the background there, even if it's wonderfully presented, is very often polished. What I like very, very much, those novels who are, let's say, only important for a very short time being, I don't know, they somehow were lost. They were important, I know, only for 2-3 years, and everybody forgot about them. Because I think, let's say, maybe the artists were not so great, but they focus much more on the contexts. Yeah. So let's say the characters, the protagonists are not so Polish. Yeah, well, Polish person speaking about Polishing, yeah? Yeah. So, and I think this is important. So I think it could be a very nice point of view. And I think, of course, if you are dealing with interwar Droho, but you mentioned Bruno Schulz, I think is a must, not only for a historian of literature, but also for historian of culture, urban historians, just to go one through another. Let's say I was involved for years with the project of Stefan Grabinski, who was writing fiction, a kind of, we called him maybe exaggerating, I'm Polish, so we like exaggerations, like the Polish Edgar Allan Poe. And who was very popular, let's say 1918, 1923, and then totally forgotten. Now, because let's say this kind of genre is very, very popular for the last 15 years, we are looking at Grabinski not only as a ghost stories, because he was using railway and ghost stories together, yeah, so modernity and romanticism in the same time. But we also can find lots of points of reference in Przemyśl Street, in Lviv Street, in Eastern Galicia, atmosphere. So let's say I'm not interested in all this, let's say, literary topics, but I'm interested in the background. Yeah? So yes, definitely, at least we try. Being, of course, careful, deciphering everything, and of course knowing the context. But I think even in this genre, like I know ghost stories, you can find lots of, let's say, local stuff. And so, as I said, even those people who were neglected for decades, now they can be reread once again.
Thank you. I would agree. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question.
Okay. Have we exhausted our questions and ourselves?
Yeah. Lunch.
So, once again, Tomasz, thank you very much for coming and for delivering this lecture. I think we all have learned interesting stuff, new stuff. We have heard things that will give us some food for thought. And now we need to get some proper food. So,
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.